What's going on, folks? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pitt podcast, your daily podcast covering the Pittsburgh Panthers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As usual, I am Nick Farabaugh, right for Pittsburgh Sports Now, call games at WPTS Radio, and I am a production assistant at ACC Network. And folks, today we're going to talk about Pitt men's basketball. They fall to Georgia Tech at home after that 3-game win streak, and I will have a special guest joining me today. It'll be Stephen Gertz from Rivals. We'll talk about it all here coming up on Locked On Pitt.
You are Locked On Pitt, your daily podcast on the Pittsburgh Panthers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, folks? Welcome back to the Locked On Pitt podcast. As always, appreciate you guys for making Locked On Pitt your first listen every day. Like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. If you're listening, leave a review. Give me feedback. Always want to make this show as good as it can be. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. And folks, I guess we got to get right into it. We got to talk about the albatross in the room. It's Pitt, Georgia Tech, Pitt losing. And that's when I welcome in my guest, Stephen Gertz. And Steve, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing well, man. How about you, Nick?
I'm doing really great. And so it's been great to have you on, Stephen. And I really wanted to talk to you through a few things about Pitt, because again, you have the former NBA scout cred. You know this stuff like it's essentially the back of your hand. And Pitt overall, I guess the difference between their 3-game win streak against Florida State, NC State, and UNC, and then to this game against Georgia Tech, it felt like to me the guard play was just on a different level. And it felt like when their guards started to find a groove in that 3-game win streak, it felt like this was a massive step back, at least for me.
Yeah, I definitely agree from the guard standpoint for sure. None of the Burton and Odakali did not have a really good game. Horton shot the ball okay, but, did have some turnovers, dribbling, passing. I think that was one of the things that really stood out is, a lot of their struggles were attributed to dribbling the ball, passing the ball. You mentioned their 3-game win streak. One of the things you saw that Pitt actually has adjusted to is teams started hedging Pitt's ball screens a ton. And so what Pitt has kind of countered with is you've seen some of those ram screens where someone does the screen-to-screener action. That's allowing Collier particularly, even Gueye and Hughley to kind of set a screen with their defender trailing so they can't hedge. Now, Georgia Tech plays a lot of that zone, so you didn't get to see a lot of that action. They weren't able to use a lot of ball screens. That's how Femi gets going, particularly rejecting ball screens. That's a big part of Burton's game, and I think that really contributed to some of their struggles.
Yeah, which I find interesting because Jeff Capel said in the postgame that he was worried about this matchup, and I think you just kind of explained why. It kind of left Pitt's guards and their strengths. It kind of counteracted what they did. But I guess when you look at it overall, what's the biggest issue for that team? Why can't they break a 1-3-1 that Georgia Tech was running a good bit? Why is that zone so potent against them? Is it because they need that point guard? Is it because they need another penetrator? Do they need a quicker guy there? What's the way to fix that for next year?
Well, I think it's actually something that you've been touching on recently, Nick, is they don't really have that point guard that can kind of dictate flow and get them into things. They do a lot of kind of your turn, my turn when it comes to Femi and when it comes to Jamarius, and that kind of takes them out of rhythm. So because it takes them a long time to get into some of their actions, their early actions, whether it's DHO with dribble handoffs, or you've seen some Chicago action, you've seen some of those things, wedges, ramps, they don't really do a lot of that effectively. So they're left with about half the shot clock trying to get into something. You saw some success early with Horton in the corner and Gueye in the corner, and that was how to attack that 1-3-1. And then they just kind of go away from it for times. I just think, and that comes down to either what's coming in from the sidelines or that just coming into the point guards or the guys playing point guard, not getting them and keeping them in that flow.
Yeah, and so I've always thought of, you talk about the point guard thing, I've always thought of Femi Odakali as a off-ball guard / wing that can create with his dribble. I think he's a really good driver of the basketball. When he gets in there, I think he has enough good court vision when he gets in there where he can kick it out or whatever you want to do, dish it underneath. I think he can do that, and I thought we saw that against UNC a lot, but I've never thought of him as a point guard, and he's averaging almost 3 turnovers per game, which I think is indicative of that. Now, I think Jamarius Burton is more of in the point guard role, but I don't think he's a true point guard. I think he's more of a combo guard that can occasionally be that point guard when you need him to be, but he's not the guy you necessarily want him to be. And even if they had Nike Sabande here, Nike Sabande is not a point guard either. So really, it's been a while since we've seen Pitt have a true point guard. I guess the last guy you can maybe look to that was a true point guard was Sidney Deer when he gave him a little bit of minutes in 2018, 2019 there. But it's been a while for Pitt when they have had that quarterback type point guard that was so common with this team under Jamie Dixon, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned City and Deer. I think when you go back to that true point guard, I think people. It's funny at the time didn't really appreciate this guy enough, but I think now would just trade anything to have him back, and that's James Robinson, right? A guy that's really controlling the tempo of the game, takes care of the ball. You mentioned Femi's turnovers there. I mean, James Robinson was like a 5-to-1 assist to turnover guy, and he just took timely shots. By the time he was a senior, he would just take those timely shots from dead on and hit those threes, and that's kind of what Pitt needs. I think you were pretty spot on in your evaluation of the guards so far. They just don't really have that, and I think it just puts them in a position where they're unable to dictate flow, first of all, and then they're unable to kind of sustain whatever flow they do end up finding themselves in.
Yeah, and I think it's so huge for a guy like Ithiel Horton, where you talk about a catch and shoot guard that can really hit it from anywhere beyond the arc. And we've seen Horton be able to create off dribble now, too. We've been able to see him create and drive and make some floaters, make some mid range jumpers from the elbow or from the baseline, whatever it might be on the block. He's been able to do a lot of different things. And I feel like if I'm looking at what would be big for next year's team, if you're talking about winning next year, Jeff Capel gets this 5th year that he probably is going to get. You need a guy that can unlock Horton, and then Nike Sabande will also be unlocked by that. I think Femi Odukali, with his physicality, if you get Femi Odukali off ball and he can play anywhere from the 2 to the 4, really. If you're going small ball, you can go to the 4. I think that Femi's skill set would also be really opened up by that point guard. That's why I think it's so tough, but also the tough part is if you're going to have your top 4 guards back next year, it's going to be tough to sell a guard to come in and see where his minutes are. Maybe you can get someone to come in, but it's not going to be an easy haul if you already have 4 guards that you're comfortable with.
That's a good point, Nick. They're definitely going to have a rotation. Of course, everyone has to stay, but if it's those 4 guards that crack that rotation, you're right. Femi does give them some flexibility, I think, especially defensively to play other positions. I think right now with Burton and Femi, they do a lot of their damage kind of at the end of the shot clock, right? Femi's going to reject a Hughley screen. He's a counter driver, so he's going to use that defensive momentum, try to counter drive off that screen, get in the lane. Burton, same kind of guy, right? He's just going to use that high ball screen. If they can find somebody to be better earlier in the shot clock to get them into something or get stuff out of their horn sets a little bit more, or get stuff out of their flex sets a little bit more, I think then you can see a path for someone coming in and playing sooner than later, because those guys right now aren't really bringing that as much. And you're right, everyone can play off that. I think one of the things they really, really miss with Nike Sabande is that he was able to attack immediately off the dribble. A lot of guys' instincts at the guards: catch, call screen, dribble, dribble, dribble. Nike was a guy: catch, immediately attack, and that collapses the defense. And it's kind of an opposite effect that he has with Horton. And I think that's why you saw those guys be very successful towards the end of the season. Didn't win every game, but they were putting up some good numbers.
Yeah, and I think it's something definitely to consider as you go forward. The point guard need has been shown very, very clearly for this team over the last few games. But I do want to get into it a little bit more. But first, let me let you guys know about BetOnline, because football might be over for this season, but basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, player performance props to where the next fired coach is going to land, betonline.net is the #1 spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC odds, right to the Olympic coverage and information. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, folks, welcome back here to the Locked On Pitt podcast, continuing to talk a little bit about Pitt, the needs they have. And Stephen, I want to get into this game against Georgia Tech a little bit more specifically. We touched on that, then talked about kind of their overall needs for a point guard. I guess defensively in this game, I thought this was the big difference for them. Both in transition, I thought they were really bad in transition. The turnovers were bad, and they couldn't get back in transition. But also the dribble drive of guys like Usher and DeVoe really hurt this team. It felt like Pitt's defensive effort was just worse. Now, what do you attribute that to? I know that Capel and Gueye said that it was actually partially energy. Did you see that lack of energy? And is there something more deeper to that defensive struggle that they had against this Georgia Tech team?
Well, I definitely think it was a lack of energy. I mean, when you come out and you say we just didn't have that same energy, and they played those kind of like 4 games right in a row, or over like a 10-day span or whatever that was, and maybe you're seeing the backside of that a little bit. But in terms of preparation and in terms of energy, I think this is one of the first times you could really look at playing hard has been like their moniker. Well, we played real hard. But this is kind of game I think you look at. You mentioned those transition buckets. I think the epitome of that is like I think one came off like a made free throw, and they were able to get a layup on the other end. Georgia Tech was. That's just a sign. I mean, you can't say they're playing with a ton of energy in those situations. I think 4 of the first 6 baskets that Georgia Tech made were layups. They conceded quite a few layups, quite a few open threes, and it wasn't necessarily to DeVoe and Usher. You let all those other guys get going early, and then like Rodney Howard, I tweeted how it looked like Dwight Howard at some point because of that. So they did not do well defensively in basically any aspect.
Yeah, it was tough to watch. The only 2 guys that it seemed like at times were playing with urgency was Gueye and Hughley, and Hughley was more on the offensive end. Gueye had an unbelievable game, and,
Yes.
and I think defensively, the issue becomes if your guards aren't playing with energy, and we saw, Burton being a little bit he's kind of worn down. I wonder if Jamarius Burton, who has been so good, and I know he's well conditioned, but playing 40 minutes essentially every night has worn him down. Ithiel Horton coming in a little later into the season. I don't think his conditioning is necessarily 100%. He hasn't played a full season of basketball, so maybe it improves. But I wonder if this stretch for guys like Burton, Odukali, and Horton, who essentially have to play the whole game, they don't really have a backup guard outside of Isaiah Kudo, and he's seen his minutes dwindle more and more. I think the lack of guard depth, and this is where you get Nike Sponde coming up again. I think the lack of guard depth has worn down the team to a degree to where over time, over these long stretches, you're not going to see the sustained energy because they're probably just sore, and quite honestly, at times they can't get up to it.
Yeah, I think the season is certainly catching up, to a lot of those guys. Capel's mentioned, Hughley's kind of in a freshman year in terms of being this deep in February. And obviously Horton wasn't around the team. Ezzy Okuda is not normally going to log this many minutes. And maybe Femi's a little bit more used to that, but you're now asking him to do a lot of things. One of the things I've really talked about recently is how often you see him defending in the post. So he can do this because of his lengths, but he was banging with Brady Manick just one game before this. That's not a guy that, and Brady's a shooter, but that's not really a situation where you want to keep putting your, 6'4" guard down there against some of the bigger guys. And then Burton's asked to navigate a lot of screens, and that could certainly beat you up. And I think all the guards have a little bit of deficiency in one area defensively. And when they kind of can't even bring, the one good thing they do to the table, though, then you see what you saw yesterday. And those guards really profile. I think I said it in my pregame that they profile as guys they've had problems defending, right? Franklin Gardner for UVA, the Langfords from BC, they've had their share of problems with a 5'6", or sorry, not 5'6", 6'5" or 6'6" type of guard that can put the ball on the floor. Has been something that's been a challenge. And no Audis Tony, I think he would have probably been that 3-and-D answer that you put out there quite a bit. And I think that's adding up.
Yeah, well, Mo Gueye's been having to essentially condense the roles of about 4 or 5 guys, it feels like, into his own little world, and he's been phenomenal this year. He's been the shot blocker. He's been essentially their 3-and-D, if you will. They need a 3-and-D wing. And here's the thing that I get worried about when we're talking about next year. Obviously, Mo Gueye had an unbelievable game last night, and it was truly something to watch. I mean, he continues to be better and better and better. And what a grad transfer he is. But I think you said it last night. He is not replaceable. And it's going to be tough to replace Mo Gueye's production, his energy, his three-pointing ability, and his shot blocking. I think, again, he's the only player in program history with 55-plus blocks and 35 or more three-pointers made in a season. So this is a type of guy we've really never seen come through Pitt.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be hard to replace him. And the thing is, there's guys with that kind of skill set out there, but everybody wants a guy like that. And they talk about how they didn't know he could shoot like this. They knew they were going to get a defensive type of big. They didn't see the shooting coming. So Cable and I kind of stumbled on this. You look at a guy last year, he was able to do both those things. Well, his name's Evan Mobley, and he's in the NBA. He's probably going to be rookie of the year. So these guys just don't grow on trees. And, people have mentioned it. You hit on it. You might have to look at a couple different guys to fill in, not the statistical production, but everything you mentioned that he brings to the table. And, that just lets you know how rare that he is. You saw teams actually scheme against his defensive impact. I think couple games ago, teams started doing a lot of exchanges in terms of ball screens, right? So they're going to exchange where Gueye is not going to allow him. They're going to lift his guy up the perimeter so that he can't wreak havoc at the rim. And Pitt's countered by just switching that action, which I was a huge advocate for. And so you see that teams are really trying to be like, how can we not get our shots blocked by this guy? And that has a huge amount of value, regardless of the stats that you mentioned and you pointed out. I mean, the fact that you have to sit down and be like, okay, well, how do we not let this guy wreak havoc on our offense is definitely a big time value for Pitt, and not sure how they're going to find a guy that can do that.
Well, he's the type of guy that is, as you mentioned, a really a unicorn in terms of, every team wants a guy like this, and I've seen people refer to this position kind of as like a hybrid post where they're just very rare, but you can have shot blocking and 3-point shooting in one player, and every team wants one of these. I guess if you look at guys that can do it, maybe like an Anthony Davis type player, and I know that Mo doesn't really bang down low like he does, but kind of in the same mold type of guy where he does this. And Guy is just a guy that is going to be so tough to replace. And as I've said, I think that they need a 3-and-D guy, and ideally they're going to need a big too, a shot blocking big, whether that's a power forward or a true center, to come in and help them. It's tough. The issue is there's only one open scholarship right now. I'm assuming that there's going to be more to open up, but you can't lose Femi, you can't lose John Hughley, you can't lose Ithio Horton, you can't lose any of the guys that you need. You have this core of 5, which is Horton, Jamarius Burton, Femi Odekale, John Hughley, and Nike Sabande for next year, and all 5 of them have to come back. And so you have to open up scholarship somehow to replace Mo Gueye. It's going to take at least 2 people, in my opinion, to replace him. Maybe they get a jump from Will Jeffress, maybe it's Noah Collier taking a jump, but it's going to come from somewhere. And I feel like the portal is obviously the best option, but they need a lot to replace what Mo Gueye brings.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, they stumbled on the shooting ability of Gueye. I don't know if Lightning is going to strike twice in that way. But you mentioned 2 names in there, with Will and Noah, and they each bring something to the table. But we've also seen, those guys are taking maybe 1 or 2 shots a game. There's a lot of nights, 0 points off the bench. And they don't bring the same defensive impact that Mo does. And even though he doesn't bang down low, as you mentioned, like an AD can, you kind of see more of that like Christian Wood game when he kind of broke out in the NBA as a shot blocker guy who had that perimeter skills. I mean, that's a huge compliment to Mo Gueye, but at the same time, trusting him to defend on the perimeter and be able to cover ground and help underneath is such a rare skill set that none of the incumbents I could see getting to that point. You're right. It's going to have to be the portal, and they're going to have to get lucky.
Absolutely, they will be, as we're going to continue to talk about here. But first, folks, let me let you know about Built Bar, because this is the time of year where I know everyone gives up on their New Year's resolutions, but not this year. You could stick to your resolution to eat right thanks to Built Bar. It almost feels like it doesn't have to be a resolution because you can actually enjoy eating them. Because if you tried the Built Bar Puffs, I know if you haven't had it, you are missing out, because they are one of Built Bar's best tasting bars. They're the first ever protein-infused marshmallow. They're fluffy, they're marshmallowy. They're not just a protein bar, they're a treat, and they're covered in 100% real chocolate. All Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, including puffs. But here's the catch. You also get all the benefits of a protein bar, low in calorie, low in sugar, low in carbs, high in protein. So replace your candy bars with these. You'll be healthier in no time. Here's all you have to do. Go to Built.com, use the promo code LOCKS15 and get 15% off of your order. Use the promo code LOCKS15 for 15% off at Built.com. All right, folks, welcome back here to the Locked On Pitt podcast as we continue to talk. Here, Stephen Gertz, Nick Farabaugh talking about Pitt, Georgia Tech in this loss that Pitt has suffered. And Stephen, somehow we haven't talked about John Hughley much to this point, but I've talked about him at length on this show. And I feel like, another really good game for Hughley in this one. He had a double-double. Him and Gueye were essentially the 2 guys that carried this team to the finish line, if you will. And John Hughley in that mid-range game has started to come on in the last 3 or so games, but this guy is a special player, and there's going to be a fear of losing him, whether it's the portal. I think he's going to explore the draft. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that he probably is going to go and try that draft out, the process out. But this is a guy that is really been quite the find for Jeff Capel. I think people thought he might be good. I'm not sure if we ever thought he'd be this good this early.
Yeah, I guess, got to give a little bit of credit here to Cable and his staff for understanding probably what they had in Hughley. I think the miss has been at times not understanding, to have, Justin Champagny last year who created a ton of offensive gravity and a guy you constantly had to account for. I don't think Pitt did a good job of utilizing that. I also don't think they do a great job of utilizing that this year with the offensive gravity that Hughley creates and kind of the fact that just his presence alone bends defenses. And there's only a handful of those guards and, players that have been able to take advantage of that. And I think that's been a miss, but, he's been really good. Obviously, at the next level, post play is just not that valued as much as, being able to shoot. Screen setting, he probably has a little bit of ways to go, but his passing ability is very good. And I think he's also been a pretty good post defender, which I do think carries relevance. And his ball screen defense has been decent at times. And I think that's a big thing. So, yeah, if they were to not have him, would be huge. I mean, it would just absolutely, reset the clock on this team in the program. But, he's just a guy that has been super dominant. And I think last night, as it pertains to the game, you saw the run coming early in that second half, right? They find ways every game. It just seems they run that ghost DHO and either Femi or Burton will make that pass from the wing right into the post. It seems that they can run that a lot more, even against the zone, and they just don't. And then he makes a nice little run early in that second half, and they forget about him. And they remember him at the very end of the game. And they go through long stretches of that. And it's certainly contributed to some of their losses for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's been an issue for them all year. And Hughley's not been a guy, he gets volume, but the volume doesn't seem to be strategically timed in correct places. And that's been something that I've been kind of worried about with this team. And I guess to ask you this, coaching at large on this team, I think that there's always been a few issues that really do raise eyebrows. This team has had talent. It's not like they're devoid of talent under Jeff Capel. I mean, Xavier Johnson and Audis Tuning are starting on likely NCAA tournament teams this year. Justin Champagne's in the NBA. John Hughley's obviously great. I mean, they have talent. They've had talent under Jeff Capel. The recruiting has been fine in terms of talent evaluation and actually talent coming into the program. But this team right now, it feels like they're playing above their sum parts, but still you see some of the same issues, the weird turnovers that they have down the stretch. I mean, I think some of that stuff should not be happening in mid-February. The end of the game stuff, I thought, passing up open threes to take contested twos is weird to me. I mean, there's a lot in letting 15 seconds run off the clock on that second to last possession for Georgia Tech. There's a lot, I feel like, from a coaching standpoint that I see that's an issue, but maybe you see even deeper. Maybe it's in their offensive sets, their defensive sets, whatever it might be. But I think there's a lot of coaching issues that continually come up as a theme for this team over these 4 years and that have not been fixed under Jeff Capel and his staff.
Well, Nick, I think the biggest thing that sticks out to me is they're the worst screen setting team in the ACC over the last 4 years. It's not really that close. I mean, we see them all, and I'll probably end up watching every game at least twice. And even the teams that have not been very good just set better screens. I mean, Georgia Tech was in the cellar yesterday. I thought their screen setting was much better. Pitt's just never really been that. I think part of that is some of those guys understand there's a responsibility after setting the screen, so they flare early. Some of it is the guards' usage. I mean, their best screen setter, Noah Collier, has probably sent as many offensive foul setting screens as he has actually made really good plays out of that in terms of point production. So it's been a problem. And when you really think about offense now in 2022, it started with the Spurs and then kind of where the Warriors ended up in the early 2010s, ball screens is a huge part of everybody's offense. So if you can't do that, and Pitt obviously doesn't have great isolation players unless you consider, Hughley on the block isolated, but that's how you unlock good offense. And that's just something that they don't do. I mean, they run that horns action. Hughley will dive, Gueye lifts, and then, it's up to Gueye to either make a play, the guard cuts through and tries to set a flex screen. There's almost no contact on any of that stuff. And that just doesn't allow guys that are limited offensively to get space, to have a defense bend to them or anything like that. And I think that's caught, they can't create advantages. Defensively, you nailed it a lot with, the timing of certain things. You kind of saw them go to the zone during that 3-game win streak at the end as like a surprise. But I think we've also seen them go to a zone and get torched for like 5 possessions. And you're wondering, like, why are they doing this? And, the timing of certain things and some of the matchups. And again, they're not a good screen navigation team on the other side. That's a thing. Femi has had ball watching issues, but he's gotten better. Horton is not a good screen navigator. And I think that's been, kind of the downside to all the offense he brings. So when you really think about that, well, we don't set screens well and we don't defend ball screens well. That's how you end up with a team that's usually, sub 500 all the time.
Yeah, and it has been a consistent issue with the team. This year, they haven't fallen apart. It doesn't seem like the chemistry issues that have popped up in recent years have popped up, but the on-court stuff, it's still there. Even with the 3-game win streak, there were still some warning signs, and it's come up throughout the year in terms of that. And I guess now when you look at it overall, with the roster that they have, we're guaranteed only 4 more games of this team this year. Miami, Duke, Notre Dame, at least one ACC tournament game, potentially more than that if they could win, but we'll see how that works out. Does this team, I guess, Jeff Capel, it looks like he's going to get his 5th year. He won that UNC game. I think that locked it up for him. Plenty of people will call for him to be fired, but I think as you stand right now, how likely is it that this team, let's assume that, I guess that they do keep their main guys, Hughley, Femi, Jamarius, Burton, Nike Sabande, and Ithiel Horton. That's not even that might not happen. It might not happen. It's very possible one of those guys goes to the portal. But let's say that ideally goes right. How likely is it that this team next year is competing on the bubble for the NIT, for the tournament? It's got to be pretty hard, right? I mean, I'm looking at it right now. I don't think it's that likely.
I would agree with you there, Nick. I don't see the conference as a whole being down like this for long periods of time, which means, Pitt has to raise up to that level too. We all know, there's no help coming as of right now. You mentioned the one scholarship earlier, and that's not attributed to anybody right now. So with the given roster, well, we know at best they're a little bit below middle of the pack with the guys now in a down ACC. Now you do project a little bit more, right? You project all those guys to take some small step forward, but at the same time, there's a lot of big leaps that may or may not happen. And again, you're not going to have Gueye, and he's been a big part of what they're doing. So even with that core 5, he's not going to be a part of that. And I think that sets them back. So do I think that, they'll be in that position? I mean, I guess a lot could change, but right now, I mean, I'm with you. The trend is to be even the talk to be on the bubble for an NIT, I think would be a victory. And I mean, let alone the tournament. As for these last games, I think would it surprise anybody to have a puncher's chance in one of these after losing to Georgia Tech? Absolutely not. Would it be surprising for them to lose all these 3 games in terrible fashion? Yeah, I don't think that'd surprise anybody either. So it's so hard to predict with these guys on any given night. But when you really kind of look at it and what's going to be, what you project, I could see another season very close to this one.
Yeah, and if that's the case, and again, I get Jeff Capel's going to get the chance to give himself another year, let things go. But he's now got, when he accumulated that talent, it felt like last year was their chance to really pop through. It felt like it. And then obviously all the off-court stuff happened, and John Hughley was lost for the year, and all this happened, and essentially it cracked. I felt like that was the team last year where they had legitimate depth. They had legitimate talent. I feel like if the stuff off the court doesn't necessarily happen, the team chemistry issues don't happen. And then you could see them be punched through. But now Jeff Capel doesn't have the allure to sell the vision that he's building something here. He's going to be in year 5. So it's tough to sell recruits. And this is why I think you saw Judah Mintz commit in the same way. And it's tough. And so I get he's probably going to get a year 5. But, man, if I am a recruit or I am in the portal, it's tough for Jeff Capel to sell me on a vision. It just feels like, again, because it looks so unlikely, it just feels like he's almost like a dead man walking at this point, and it's tough. And he's going to have to really pull off a heck of a job, I think, to get this team turned into a point where he gets a 6th year.
Yeah, that could definitely be tough. You talked earlier on about the guard rotation next year. What's your conversation with a guard? If you're trying to get a guard here, how do you sell them on the fact that you're going to return 4 experienced guards that definitely have time to play? If you're, a big, or a post player, well, you're not going to be in front of John Hughley. So it comes down to, like we talked about, you could try to be in the guys that are going to be like Gueye. Well, those guys are probably looking to go pro or play at a big time winning program. And those guys aren't going to be. So like the one conversation you could have, the next Mo Gueye that shoots and blocks shots, well, that Pitt is probably not the destination you're looking to come to, even if you can say, well, look what this guy just did. So it's going to be tough. And, I think we'll have another year. And then, yeah, you have to think about that year 6. If you've had just 4 or 5 losing seasons, is this the best fit at that point? And you're right, though, the vision, the brick by brick and all those other things are great taglines. But at this point, you may only have one brick up or two bricks up. I think at this point, people are looking for more of a foundation than that.
Yeah, and I agree completely with it. I think that Pitt continuously has to try and grow it. And I think the good thing that he could do first is land Noah Bachelor, who decommitted from Memphis. He sounded like he was going to commit to Pitt previously. I think he's a guy that can fit 2 through 4, can fill some of the Mo Gueye stuff. He's a guy that can contribute next year as a freshman. So getting a young guy in there that could actually contribute to the team right away would be nice. And I also think the other thing we haven't talked about is you're going to need some guys because, again, they have limited scholarships. Maybe a guy like Oladapo goes into grad transfers. Maybe Onyebuchi is a Kudo graduates and moves on with his life's work. Maybe get Chris Payton now. Maxim Mudison transfers. All these guys, you can see all this happening. But also the other guys that we've talked about, Noah Collier, Will Jeffress, Nate Santos, who played significant minutes early in the year. Santos is only a freshman. Those guys are probably going to have to take at least decent enough leaps to where they can be bench players for you and they can give you some type of, I guess, quality minutes. I guess the one I guess I like Noah Collier, what he's brought. I thought he's had some gritty defensive minutes recently, but Jeffress is really a rebounder defensive guy who his shot hasn't come along. And while Santos started off real hot and he was known for shooting, his shooting hasn't translated just yet. And maybe he just wasn't ready. So they're going to need guys on their bench to also take that step up and help this team because they're going to need to be at least 8 deep, I think.
I would 100% agree with that. We talked about the bench not really giving them any points, and that's usually without Santos getting any minutes. I think for, starting with Nate, he loses the point of attack a lot off the dribble. And you saw early in the season in those games in non-conference that, there are games where he's hitting the three, but there's a lot of guys who are getting 2 feet on the paint off the dribble on Santos. Obviously, that's a problem Pitt just had against Georgia Tech with their starters. With Will, there's an athleticism he flashes on defense that you take a look at a guy and you're like, oh my gosh, you're like 6'7", 6'8". You profile exactly like the 3 and D that Pitt would need, but you're only really bringing that D side. Although offensively, he gets a ton of offensive rebounds and there's value there, but he just hasn't been able to use that defensive athleticism on the offensive end. He's putting the ball on the floor a little more, but just the three aspect and the jumper just not there. And then Collier. I mean, look, if Collier grows like 2 inches and adds 20 pounds, I think Pitt's like really in business next year with him. But presuming that is not the case, he slots in kind of funny. 6'8", 200 pounds. At the next level is more of like a 3. Pitt needs him to be like more of a 3-4 in his game. Sometimes is more like a 5. So I think that's kind of where they are with him now. I think he will. I predicted him to have a breakout year. I think in some ways, I guess you could say he did. But he has to be able to shoot at some point. Like, I think finishing around the rim has to go up, but he doesn't give you like that dunker spot jumper. He doesn't give you like that elbow jumper. For a guy that can really roll and be dangerous, that short roll that you've seen with Femi and Hughley, that they did one game then just completely stopped doing it for, reasons that we can't explain. I don't know if Collier can really get there at least. I think any kind of pick and pop or something like that. So, yeah, you're right. All of those guys have to make a leap forward. But to be honest with you, I feel like all those things from what we know are big leaps. They're not just like almost there, right? Like if Will was shooting 31% from 3, it'd be like, well, he's almost there. Or if Nate was, coming in and making any shots at this point. But it is hard for shooters to come in, get one shot in 5 minutes and expect them to make it every time. And in Noah's case, he is getting the minutes, but I'd have to look and see. I think Noah's probably shot more than or less than 3 jumpers this year.
Oh,
it's got to be less. I don't remember. I don't know if I have any tape on him taking a jumper, so it could be less than 1. So those are all big leaps.
Yeah, we don't even know what his jumper form looks like from the free throw line. His free throw shooting form is a little wonky and non-traditional to me, and I feel like that's something that should get fixed. But we do not know what his jumper looks like at all. But Noah Collier is going to have to be someone that they get big minutes from for sure. And I think overall, this team is just going to have a lot of things that have to go right for them next year to compete. Well, Steve, thanks for coming on, man. Let everyone know where they can find you, find your work, read your stuff, do all that great stuff.
Yeah, you could find me on Twitter, at Stephen with a PH _ Gertz. I write for Rivals Panther Lair. You could check out my stuff there. And that's pretty much the main places.
All right, folks. that was all for today's episode. As always, thanks for listening. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about Miami, obviously coming to the Pete. We'll see if Pitt can maybe upset one of the top 4 teams in the ACC. And we'll also talk about women's basketball. Jayla Everett was dismissed from the team this weekend. We'll talk about the impact of that, Lance White's outlook, and all of that coming up. So, folks, as always, thanks for listening as we finish. Hail to Pitt.